I'm Dr. Brad Roberts, the Director of the Center for Global Security Research, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's session on Genomes, the era of purposeful manipulation begins, with Dr. Carol Kuntz. The topic needs little introduction to the laboratory community. There's a strong and abiding interest in genomic science and in the benefits, costs, and risks associated with manipulation of this technology. This is a topic that we've taken up periodically in work here at CGSR and in lectures we've sponsored for the community. But today we're going to hear about a recent report produced by the Center for Strategic and International Studies of a study led by Dr. Carol Kuntz. She is an adjunct fellow at the Center for Strategic International Studies, which is a Washington, D.C. based bipartisan think tank, and is involved there in their program on strategic technologies. She also serves as an adjunct professor at both Georgetown and George Washington universities, where she teaches courses on artificial intelligence. She made this transition to the think tank and academic worlds after departing the Department of Defense in 2019 after 30 years of service there. In summary, that 3 decades of work focused on identifying changes in the strategic and technological environments in which defense policy and planning occurs, and crafting new policies and programs in light of those changes. As one example, in the several years before COVID-19 emerged, she sought to embed cutting-edge biotechnologies into the department's biodefense program in order to strengthen its ability to rapidly configure vaccines to protect against novel pathogens. As another example, for the 5 years after the 9/11 attacks, she served as the Homeland Security Advisor to the Vice President of the United States. Carol has received numerous awards over the course of her government career, including twice receiving the Secretary of Defense Medal for Meritorious Civilian Service. She has a bachelor's from Cornell University, a master's in public administration from Princeton University, and a PhD in political science from MIT. She'll make introductory remarks with PowerPoint slides of approximately 30 to 45 minutes. Then we'll turn to a Q&A portion. To prepare for the Q&A portion, please raise your hand electronically during her presentation or as she wraps up. Or if you prefer, send me a note in the chat function, and I will try to ensure that your comment or question there comes into play before our time runs out. You will find in the chat function a link to the report that she's going to speak about today. Thanks to Katie. Thank you, Katie. So without further ado, Carol, thanks so much for making the time to do this. Thank you for your leadership on these topics. Over to you.
Thank you, Brad. Brad and I crossed paths in the Pentagon back in the day, and I'm absolutely delighted to be here with you today. I'm also delighted to provide this briefing at Lawrence Livermore because several members of the technical staff were extremely helpful to me during the research phase. And Jim Brazzi recently was kind enough to participate in a panel on this topic at CSIS. So I'm really delighted to be here and look forward to our discussion during the Q&A. So next slide. So this is the fundamental motivating concern of the report. And I suspect this is familiar, but at any rate, DoD, I think, is failing to incorporate cutting edge technologies. This is a view that's broadly held if you look at the literature. And secondly, I'm concerned, particularly in this technology area, that the United States more broadly is failing to build the tools, not so much for discovery, but for applications in this advanced biotech space. Next slide. So then we can ask ourselves, what is different? What has caused these worrisome trajectories to emerge, both with regard to national security capabilities at DoD and with these strategic capabilities, if you will, in the broader US domestic sector? And I identify these three sources. Again, I think these are, again, since I benefited from so many discussions with you and other technical experts, I do think there's something different about the source, nature, and paces of advances. There's obviously the role of China, which we'll talk more about later. And then I do think that the importance of artificial intelligence, while it's very well understood in a technical setting such as Lawrence Livermore, coming from the policy community as I do, I really believe it is not well understood how vital artificial intelligence will be as a tool of innovation in this new in coming decades, and that is under-recognized and is not being advanced by an appropriate policy framework as it should be. I mentioned at the top of this slide that the source, nature, and pace of cutting-edge technologies is different, and that in some way invalidates our traditional technical approaches. The source, I think, is the sort of global commercial and academic sector. And sometimes at this point, I note that in World War II, we could instead send people to a mountaintop in New Mexico and put a fence around them and have emerge an extraordinary technology. But perhaps an allusion to that historical case study is unnecessary at one of the DOE labs. But instead of these sort of government-led, capital-intensive efforts, which characterized World War II and immediately subsequent to World War II, a lot of the technical advances are out of this more globalized commercial and academic sector. The nature of the actors are relatively low capital, small actors, startups, academic researchers funded by venture capitalists. So it's much more fluid and smaller in nature. And the pace is very, very rapid. And I think these changes have particular implications for necessary changes to the characteristics of the DoD science and technology ecosystem. But it also has other implications. And I'll talk about these two other points in greater detail on later slides. Next slide. So I think, again, to this audience, I don't need to walk through this, but I did want to note that while I think some of these findings have broader implications for cutting edge technologies in general, I did look with particular care at these technologies that enable the purposeful manipulation of the genome. And as Brad noted in his introductory remarks, this audience is quite familiar with this. One of the things that's remarkable is it is this convergence in multiple technologies that enables this remarkable new technology. Obviously, the CRISPR-Cas that enables more precise edits to genomes. But what makes it purposeful are the machine learning algorithms that can identify which edits are necessary to create a particular desired change in the traits of the resulting molecule or organism. So that's one of the things that I particularly learned, although it's well known to this audience. It was particularly, one thing I learned was the profound importance of machine learning to inform this constellation of technologies. And I think that's true in several other applications of machine learning. Next slide. So I'm going to just briefly touch on some of my findings with regard to DoD. But just briefly, I talked earlier about profound changes in the scope, the source, nature, and pace of these cutting edge technologies. And I think those characteristics make the sort of classic, relatively internally focused DoD S&T ecosystem somewhat outdated. And I think DoD needs to not strive to replicate technology sectors inside of DoD in these cutting edge areas, and instead rely on a strategy of strengthening its ties to the commercial and academic sector, generating these remarkable advances. Next slide. So as I said, I think fundamentally DoD needs to build more direct links. And I have some of the strategies that are further developed in the report outlined here. But with the exception of the next slide, I intend to focus the rest of my formal presentation on this final point, with DoD joining other stakeholders in assuring the health of the domestic sector. I would, though, be delighted to talk in more detail about my DoD recommendations in the Q&A. I just didn't want to run too long in my formal remarks. So this next slide is the only additional slide I wanted to show about the DoD component of my findings. Recall that I urge DoD to rely more on the domestic, commercial, and academic sector as opposed to internal sectors, which are classified. Obviously, some work will have to be classified, but I do argue that many of the cutting edge technologies have the characteristic that they can be, rapidly configured. And I urge that there be a relative move away from relying on classified defenses to an ability to rapidly configure countermeasures. So this slide notes, I point to cyber, vaccines, and adversarial attacks using poison data and artificial intelligence. In these areas, I do think it's a characteristic of the technology that the technical threshold is very low for an adversary to slightly alter the attack mode and render our countermeasures ineffective. And so instead of getting in that countermeasure cycle with an adversary in these technology areas, it's much more important to focus on our instead of having sort of classified defenses against a particular attack mode, given the ease of an adversary altering that mode, DoD should focus on an ability to rapidly configure tailored countermeasures. And this would be a way where it could trade some classification for working more closely with the with the domestic sector, and still preserve its ability to have effective defenses in these key technology areas. Next slide. As I noted, I'm going to shift away, though, from the DoD findings in the report so as to not to consume too much time, and instead focus on the point that I make that DoD has to join other aspects of U.S. interests, the U.S. government, in being a key stakeholder in the health of our domestic, commercial, and academic sector in the advanced biotechnologies, which includes artificial intelligence. So I want to talk about some of the risk, starting with this slide, and then some of my specific recommendations about how to assure the health of that domestic sector. So you'll recall when I talked about what has changed, what has caused these trajectories to move in a worrisome direction. The first was the scope, nature, and pace of these cutting edge technologies. And I've talked about some of those characteristics. My second point was about China. And I know obviously the challenges posed by China are a regular point of discussion here at the lab. I do think, in addition to the general challenges posed by China, there are certain characteristics of the biotechnologies and of artificial intelligence that China's state structure is somewhat better able to benefit. Now, I don't at all mean to imply that China's state structure is superior. I just want to flag these characteristics. And I think these are characteristics that U.S. policy can, manage and overcome. But I do just want to flag them in the context of the advanced biotechnologies. And I do so in some detail on the next slide. So this is a very wordy slide, but I did want to get these points just right for you. So I have four characteristics that makes the China threat or the China challenge particularly problematic in these advanced biotechnologies, and particularly the artificial intelligence that supports them. And again, I suspect many of these are quite familiar to individuals here. China obviously it finds it vastly easier than the United States to create large, well-curated databases. Folks here are probably quite familiar with the posited enormous size of the databases at BGI and the relative paucity of such databases in the United States. The second point is the use of predatory pricing. The DNI, and particularly its Office of Counterintelligence, has issued several unclassified papers on this topic, which points to the use of predatory pricing by the US government to provide low-cost, large-scale DNA sequencing to US healthcare providers. And this raises certain concerns. There's also the extent to which I talked about how small actors in my third point are the critical innovators in most of these cutting edge technologies, startups, academic researchers, and venture capitalists. And so these are, disaggregated actors, but China can have them act as counterparts to actors in the US context. But back in China, the Chinese government is able to put together the perspectives and the information gathered by these small actors into an integrated government policy. So I think that's another way that Chinese state structure at present benefits it in this area. And finally, the biotechnologies, particularly the advanced biotechnologies, as we'll talk about in more depth later on, does raise profound ethical and cultural issues. And several writers in this field have posited that those different ethical and cultural perspectives may ease China's ability to advance in these technology areas. So anyway, I know that's a lot of words, but I do think there's some interesting elements that make the Chinese strategic challenge in this technology area particularly grave. And I did want to highlight those characteristics for you. Next slide. So I want to transition now, as I have indicated, talking about some specific recommendations for the health of the domestic technology sector. And as I outlined before, I think this is critically in DoD's interest. DoD needs to become a stakeholder in that health, along with other aspects of society. So I think the health of this sector is critical for national security purposes to support DoD. And I also think because of strategic purposes, this is a sector that is going to have the prospect of really reinforcing technological advances and economic growth. So in addition to the national security considerations, there are important strategic considerations just for the health of the nation, its technology sector, its economic growth, that this sector needs to be healthy. And you can see the three broad recommendations that will organize the remainder of my talk this morning. So next slide. So this just is the transition slide. So let's move into the next section on legitimate heritable human genome editing. Next slide. So before I get into this topic, let me acknowledge that it is morally resonant, politically fraught, and technically complex. And acknowledge that there are very many legitimate and worthy criticisms of this proposed policy. The thing that led me to want to offer a specific policy in this area is my concern, frankly, that it is very possible that the current US policy is actually the worst possible policy in this area. It's constraining advances in the United States in this area, even those that could be characterized as legitimate, and it's doing nothing to try to shape the norms abroad. Let me note at the outset of this section that when I use legitimate and illegitimate, I'm using those terms consistent with the definitions given in a 2020 study by the National Academy of Sciences, done in concert with the Royal Society of Science. Legitimate are principally those to treat serious, otherwise untreatable disease. So as you can see from this slide, I do, with all of those many caveats attached, recommend that the United States allow legitimate HHGE to proceed, while at the same time it leads international efforts to build norms. Next slide. So obviously, one of the benefits of this is that legitimate uses of genome editing could cure disease and advance science. And it should be noted that all types of this type of gene editing is currently proscribed in major research venues in the US. It's proscribed by appropriations riders that are attached annually to the funding bills for NIH and the FDA. And I do think there's an argument that international norms could reduce editing, particularly the editing with technical errors, which I think is most likely to occur in smaller labs, perhaps in less developed science infrastructures. And it might quell the prospect of trivial fads. So those I think are important benefits, which the US currently is not seeking. Next slide. Now, there are, of course, risks to securing international norms that would prevent what one would define as illegitimate human heritable genome editing. Those risks are, the reality that I think the norms could not prevent cheating, as the 2018 case in China demonstrated. This technology is already widely diffuse. The technical thresholds are meaningful and real, but they're certainly not insurmountable, and the material is widely available. So since cheating is probably inevitable, you do have to ask the question I have here in the lighter blue box. Would that in some way, would accepting international norms on so-called illegitimate heritable human genome editing put the United States at risk, given the relative ease of cheating? Next slide. So you can see on this slide the technical assessment that sort of undergirds the assumptions I'm making. I am not a technical expert, as was avowed at the outset. I did try to talk to many experts in this field, not only at Lawrence Livermore, it should be noted, but at many other technical sites, and had a lot of discussion about what really is the likely pace at which a so-called war-winning capability could be achieved, however, horrific that prospect might be, just in sort of strict analytical terms, how likely could something like that be done? And as all of you doubtless know, there are significant epigenetic effects that add complexity to the traits that actually emerge despite our growing sophistication of the genome and how it translates into characteristics in a final organism. So this assumption on this slide 15 sort of summarizes my understanding that developing what sometimes are called super soldiers, even given where we are, the remarkable advances we've made in this area in recent years, the interaction effects among genes, the epigenetic effects, for example, the cell regulation complexities, are likely to mean that there are significant technical problems to be worked out. And so in the near and the midterm, you're not likely to have cheating, even if it were to occur, yield, as I say here, a war-winning capability. Next slide. I do encourage, though, that assertion to be, vetted and challenged and refined, because I think it's critical. And I acknowledge it's only, an attempt to distill and integrate many discussions I've had with technical experts. I do think this, obviously, I've acknowledged on the previous slide that there is a possibility that there could be theoretically a war-winning advantage accrued through illegitimate editing that proceeds despite the construction of international norms. And so here I acknowledge that in the long term, the US may need to reevaluate. But I would argue, even should that become necessary in the long term, the strategy that I'm outlining will have preserved US interest in the near and midterm, and indeed advanced it. It may be that in the long term, the norms that have been constructed would be strong enough to prevent use. I'm not a big, believer in norms all the time, I have to confess. But the one thing I can be confident of is that if we don't move to develop such norms now, they certainly will not be strong enough in some future point. And I do very much believe that this technology has profound enough implications that the United States and other allies should at least be talking about it in a diplomatic context. Another way that we're hedging against long-term risk is that the efforts on defenses and detectors certainly should proceed. I think that's a critical strategy to hedge against the potential long-term risk. And finally, as I've noted previously, the US would have a healthy sector in legitimate HHGE, and I think that's critical for many reasons. I know this is a very a complicated issue. I do worry that here, as in so many other areas, the policy framework is grievously lagging the technical advances. And so this was just my effort to reconcile this, what I understood based on my best efforts was the state of the art of the technology, with a policy that would strive to manage this technology and to the extent that it was prudent and possible, reduce the risk it poses and make its benefits as widely available as possible. So next slide. So now we're moving to the second of my three recommendations for a healthy domestic sector in the advanced biotechnologies and artificial intelligence. This, I think, is a proposition that is probably well understood in a technical context, but I will say, as a tourist in technology venues, I don't think it's well understood in policy community. And I think, I'm going to try to convey that. And I think there should be a large-based effort to align US laws, regulations, and norms with the vital strategic priority of developing large, well-curated databases. I had several very powerful conversations with some bench scientists here at Lawrence Livermore, and they said, look, this is going to be a principal tool of innovation over the next decade, and in the absence of these databases, we're just really going to be hampered. And I have really come to be a believer of that proposition. So I make three specific recommendations on the next slide. But that the objective of all of them is to advance this strategic priority of facilitating database creation. First of all, particularly in the biotech area, I do think we're going to have to change laws, and we're going to have to create incentives for private sector data to be shared. Obviously, y'all have been an early member of the ATOM effort. And so, I think that's a terrific example of the importance of this kind of work. And I think I sought to benefit from your many successes and occasional frustrations when thinking about how to put together these recommendations. There are unique problems with access to patient data, both genomic data and health records. I do believe, and in discussions based with technical experts, have come to understand that there are technical strategies to preserve the privacy of patient data while still enabling the creation of robust and large databases with genomes and patient data to facilitate this kind of biotech research. Also, of course, the ATOM program has had these struggles getting private data sets, particularly those held by private companies. And I think we're going to have to look at a variety of enticements and possibly payments to have those databases be made available for these kinds of large research databases used for public policy purposes. I know that here and elsewhere there's discussion about what kind of organizations should manage this. And I want to combine my discussion of these, of my call for new public-private organizational models with my explanation of the third point, empower a new data ombudsman. Now, I recognize that calling for an ombudsman is not a terribly sexy recommendation. And this one always seems to be greeted as, particularly bureaucratic. But I do envision as someone in the federal government or some office or maybe a FFRDC that was responsible for finding data and making data available. And the reason I want the federal government playing that kind of role of making data available is to contrast that role, with I don't envision the federal government as playing a more direct role in creating or managing these databases in the long term. So as I came to understand the problem, and again, I came to understand it after talking with technical experts here and elsewhere, I have to confess that I originally envisioned putting the federal government in charge, which I soon came to discover was a terrible idea. And I think we need to more build a model where researchers can identify the questions they want to research. And then you've created new organizational models where a consortium, perhaps of research universities, could come together to manage a particular database, and that would and then if there was particular data that this research consortium wanted access to, and they needed to have somebody get regulations changed or laws changed, or have some federal entity specify the rules under which that data would become available, then this federal data ombudsman, or some vastly better name, would be the entity that this research consortium would go to acquire the data, or to have the norms governing the use of the data specified. But it would be these research consortiums, these new public-private organizations that were more tightly connected to the technical community, that would actually manage the creation of the database, the definitions governing the data, and would create and manage the data. So anyway, I just wanted to contrast that the data ombudsman would be the role for the federal government, which would be supporting and responding to requests from these public-private organizations. And it would be these public-private organizations, again, perhaps a research consortium, a consortium of research universities, perhaps a nonprofit like the UK Biobank, that would define what kind of databases were needed, specify the definitions, and manage the database. So I hope that's a reasonable model, and I would love to get reaction about whether or not that seems like a plausible structure to deal with this extraordinarily complex challenge. Next slide. And then my third recommendation, having looked at the importance of assuring we maintain a healthy sector to do legitimate heritable human genome editing. Secondly, to recognize the strategic priority of having large, well-curated databases and facilitating the construction of those databases by new private-public partnerships. The third thing is I was astonished to learn how these genetically modified molecules could perform an extraordinary number of useful functions. And some of those are listed here. And I do know that McKinsey, a global consultancy that you're likely familiar with, does estimate that such molecules could fuel a multi-trillion-dollar annual economic sector. So this is just one piece of data to support the assertion I have made that this technology has strategic implications in terms of the ongoing economic health of our society, in addition to our technical capabilities. So I make several recommendations to assure that we have this capability to develop useful molecules that are outlined on the next slide. So I do call for USG Grand challenges. These are perhaps much beloved in the policy community. The ones I'm most familiar with were the ones that DARPA led in autonomous driving. And it does seem that this production of useful molecules is at somewhat of an analogous state, where the technology is reasonably far along, but it does seem like a catalytic event to kind of bring it together, get some investments made to fill in a couple of gaps, to ensure domestic supply, which I do think is critical, would be very, very helpful. And so I do recommend that one or a small handful of grand challenges, perhaps a particular type of molecule, perhaps one that did some sort of climate remediation. I'm sorry, like could remediate a toxic chemical, or perhaps to serve some other useful function could be identified by a U.S. government science agency, and they would, have a prize, and again run it as a grand challenge, like the DARPA autonomous driving. What I recommended is that you have kind of a two-tier management structure in the government. You would have one science agency kind of executing the grand challenge, and then you would have a more senior sort of policy group that would be trying to derive general lessons from the process. So to run the grand challenge, you would have to put together a database to support it. And I think useful insights could be derived from that about how to facilitate database creation in general. You would have to get approval that the molecule was safe. And again, general process insights could be derived from that by the policymaking group. I do think you should put some money into assuring all the finalists have biofoundries. Biofoundries seem to be just at the point where they're being standardized, which is once you standardize a production facility, the per unit cost of production tends to go down, and that could really fuel economic advances in this sector. You also could support developing technical talent in the regions where each of the finalists in the grand challenge were located. And in this way, assure that you have good technical talent at all levels to staff the biofoundries. And the final point is that the finalist in the grand challenge could also be compensated to meet with members of the State Department to bring them up to date on this technology and inform them as the State Department officers participated in international standard setting in the area of biofoundries, synthetic biology, and some of these other technology areas. As you may be aware, there's a lot of reports in the literature about how the US government is surprisingly inactive in some of these international standard setting agencies for new technologies like 5G, like synthetic biology. And I think that really needs to be corrected. So I think the grand challenge could be a useful technique to pull together a community of experts to catalyze progress across all of the areas that this slide identifies. Next slide. So this is where we started in the briefing. I'm very concerned, and I know of at least some others who share the concern that DoD in particular is failing to incorporate cutting edge technologies in general. And I think the scope, nature, and pace of these cutting edge technologies is an aspect that particularly complicates DoD's current ability. And as I say, I have several recommendations on this. I did not develop all of them just to be sensitive to the time we have together this morning. And I also believe that the US is failing to build the tools, particularly in these. I looked particularly at the advanced biotechnologies and artificial intelligence. I am very concerned if the US is not able to pursue a healthy sector in some of these medical areas. I am newly converted to the proposition that constructing large, well-curated databases really must be a strategic priority, and we must build a policy framework that enables that. And I was astonished at how cool a lot of these synthetic engineered molecules were, how useful they were, and I really think we need to build out that sector. So I am troubled by the policy framework in this area, and absolutely astonished and excited by the technical prospects that it holds, both for national security and more broadly for the strategic interest of the United States. So I am delighted I've had this opportunity to share these thoughts with you, and I really look forward to answering questions and hearing your thoughts on my remarks.
Thank you, Carol. That was great. Very clear, very concise, very interesting, very disturbing in many ways.